بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم والعن أعداءهم. So, in order to demonstrate that these are nothing but charlatans and imposters, and so that believers aren't confused by their deception, I'll try to address a few points specific to the discussion of the hadith من مات لا يعرف إمام زمانه مات ميتة جاهلية. Then I'll provide broader metrics on how to spot imposters like these in the future. I'll summarize his points and my counter-arguments. So, first off, he claimed shamelessly and unabashedly that there is no verifiable hadith that states من مات لا يعرف إمام زمانه. In other words, he insisted, might I remind him, that there is no authentic chain in Shia literature for this hadith. Number two, he then mentioned Sahl ibn Ziyad as someone who was known to be a liar, an exaggerator, and as a narrator of this hadith, right? In other words, he used Sahl ibn Ziyad as proof that the report cannot be authentic because he is part of the chain of transmission for this hadith. Number three, he tried to present the Ahlul Bayt as some kind of a group of good people who know a thing or two about the Quran and Sunnah, but nothing more, which is really what his crusade is all about, undermining and belittling the Ahlul Bayt and attacking their position in our faith. So I then responded by demonstrating, number one, the hadith is narrated in multiple sources and attributed to several imams. One of the sources that narrates this hadith is Kamaluddin by Shaykh al-Saduq, which, newsflash, is also known as Ikmaluddin wa Itmamun Ni'mah. And it's known by that name by several key bibliographers, including Agha Buzurg al-Tahrani, as well as Al-Hurr al-Amili in his Amal al-Amil. Allam al-Majlisi also refers to the book by Shaykh al-Saduq as Ikmaluddin across most of Bihar al-Anwar. But you wouldn't know that now, would you? Not with your PhD in Arabic grammar from an Indian university run by the Buhras. Number two, my point in mentioning the two initial hadiths wasn't to discuss their isnad, but the range of sources and multiplicity of narrators. There were just two samples from dozens of hadiths on the subject. Al-Kaafi, for example, has two chapters, one of which is entitled Babun fi man dan Allah Azza wa Jal bighayri imam min Allah Jalla Jalaluh. The chapter on those who take imams that have not been appointed by God. In other words, those who follow false imams. And this chapter includes 5 ahadith which basically say the same thing. They convey the gist of the hadith man mata la ya'rif imam zamanih. The second chapter is called Babu man mata wa laysa lahu imamun min a'immat al-huda. The chapter on those who die without following an imam from the imams of guidance, meaning an imam that's not been appointed by God. This chapter includes 4 ahadith, one of which is narrated by Ibn Abi Ya'fur, who's a companion that he cites. He uses this individual to further his agenda, but we'll get to that later, inshallah, maybe in the next session. So this chapter includes 4 ahadith in the blessed book of Al-Kaafi with chains of transmission that are strong and authentic, which once again say the same thing. But the way he presents his case, if you listen to him, you'd be like, oh wow, this hadith is only found in Sunni sources. And it must have been the case that the Shia simply borrowed it from Sunnis, when in fact we now know this is a blatant lie. Number 3, I then got to the crux of the discussion, where I debunked his claim, his main claim, about the verifiability and authenticity of the hadith. So what I did was I provided one such hadith from Al-Kaafi and presented the isnad. And I went through the individuals that have narrated the hadith, people named in the chain of transmission, and it was indisputable. Even you had to backtrack and admit that. I demonstrated that when you say there is no authentic chain, you're either a liar or an illiterate, but most probably in your case, you're both. I mean, we have you on video saying that you've never actually had any formal Islamic studies. By your own admission, you're an illiterate in this topic. Watching YouTube videos, and I've said this before, doesn't turn you into a scholar. Just as nobody has ever become a physician or a doctor by browsing through Instagram posts. Honestly, save yourself further embarrassment. Anyway, moving on. After that, having been cornered and exposed, he makes a feeble attempt at saving face and says, so what if the chain is sound and the hadith is authentic? We have lots of authentic ahadith that make no sense whatsoever. But that's not what you said in the original video now, is it? You can't flip-flop and swing from one branch to another and claim to be, in your words, offering the latest and most cutting-edge research. Your street-level fanboys may buy that, but not others, not scholars, not someone with a modicum of understanding in hadith sciences. And this brings me to a fatal flaw in your entire methodology. You are both ignorant and inconsistent. You see, on the one hand, you use Rejaal to dismiss hadiths that don't fit into your anti-Shia worldview. On the other hand, you don't accept the Rejali method when it proves you wrong. Now, I'm sure that it would be a lot more convenient for you to just stick to one of those, but maybe this is a case of cognitive dissonance or just downright duplicity. When it doesn't suit you and your lie is exposed, you say the content of the hadith is problematic. And by problematic, you mean it creates problems for your case. So you conveniently throw away the hadith that doesn't serve your argument. You say, even if a hadith has authentic isnad, that's totally irrelevant because, quote, we have countless khurafat and lies and fabrications with authentic chains, end quote. So if that's the case, why waste your time on authentication if you're going to trash the hadith based on your inconsistent and sham metrics anyway? Although, as I said, that inconsistent approach does make sense because clearly you know nothing about Rejaal and simply parrot fringe or obscure individuals that you call reformist scholars. Honestly, you remind me of the idolaters who would demand a specific miracle from their prophet. Then when the miracle is presented to them, they backtrack and tell him that he's a magician. You can't resort to isnad only when it suits you and use selective citations from the most extreme fringe elements and even then lie or take things out of context, as I'll demonstrate. Now to your claim about why, as you claimed, Shia scholars have not made belief in imamah a part of the essential, non-negotiable pillars of Islam, meaning among the daruriyat. Again, this shows either your duplicity and or ignorance. You throw around some big names, perhaps to give your Zoom meeting participants a reason to cheer for you. But see, big names mean nothing if, number one, you're only using those names where it suits you and attacking those very same scholars when it doesn't. Number two, you disingenuously use those quotes out of context or completely misrepresent what those scholars are trying to say. Again, that is expected from your ilk. But let me explain to your group of 26 or so students, as you call them, why that is. Scholars who say imamah is not part of daruriyat of deen explicitly say that is to afford the legal protections provided by Islam. In other words, what's called ma huqinat bih ad-dima wa alayhi jarat al-manakih wal-mawarith. That has nothing to do with what God deems acceptable as far as salvation is concerned. The bar for being labeled a Muslim is extremely low. Believe in God and the Prophet and you're a Muslim. In other words, the shahadatain. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. You become a Muslim. But that is most certainly not sufficient for entry into paradise. In other words, there's a difference between a jurisprudential and legal position versus a theological position. The Quran itself stipulates in dozens of verses that prayer, fasting, hajj, respecting one's parents, etc., are all essential components for salvation. There are also countless sins that prevent salvation, even with belief in those non-negotiable tenets, like murder, for instance. So, what constitutes faith insofar as the worldly affairs of the individual are concerned is one thing, and what God deems acceptable for salvation is entirely different. What these scholars are saying is that a person who makes the declaration of faith is afforded certain rights, privileges, and protections exclusive to Muslims. For example, you can marry them, you can eat their food, the food that they prepare, and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean their salvation is guaranteed. Anyone who's been to madrasa knows this. So we're talking about two different things here, al-Islam and al-Iman. Even the Quran, listen to this verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَالَتِ الْأَعْرَابُ آمَنَّا قُلْ لَمْ تُؤْمِنُوا وَلَكِنْ قُولُوا أَسْلَمْنَا وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ. The Bedouins say to the Prophet that we are now believers. We have Iman in our hearts. God says to the Prophet, tell them, no, you don't have Iman. Instead, rather, say that we are Muslims. We have Islam. Iman is yet to enter your hearts. In other words, these are two very different things. Islam grants you legal protections, grants you certain rights and privileges, right? So when the scholars say that you only need to believe in God and the Prophet, and some have also added the afterlife, they're talking about the first category. They're not talking about what grants you salvation. In fact, we have other ahadith that explain further that those who reject imama like you, la yaslamun, meaning they will not be granted salvation, while they are considered Muslims in this world and are treated as such. That's insufficient in the afterlife. إِلَّا أَن يَكُونُوا مُسْتَضْعَفِينَ. Unless they are inherently deficient. They're unable to access the truth. They're unable to find out what the truth is. They are categorized as mustad'af, in which case Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala treats them with clemency and mercy and puts them in a whole different category. But if you know the truth and you are not a mustad'af and you reject imama, there is no salvation according to this huge number of ahadith. So it's not that these scholars have dismissed the hadith of man mata la ya'rif imama zamanihi. They acknowledge the hadith, they accept the hadith, and they apply the hadith in their own ahkam. In fact, Sayyid al-Khoei rahmatullah alayhi, whom you cite only when it's convenient, says in his Mu'jam Rejaal al-Hadith, when discussing one of the companions of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says, al-wajibu ala kulli mukallafin an ya'rifa imam zamaneh. Every mukallaf, every able-minded person who must apply the laws and rules and regulations of Islam must also recognize the imam of his or her time. As-Sayyid al-Sistani is another scholar that, once again, you cite disingenuously and deceptively, but this is what his actual opinion is. He was asked a question in an istifta. The question was about false claimants of imamah. People who claim to be imams, and obviously they are imposters and liars. How do we deal with them? The Sayyid gave, I think the istifta itself is about a page long. There's one portion in it which I'd like to draw your attention to, and the istifta is available on his official website. He says, رُبَّمَا اسْتُدْرِجَ لِلْإِيمَانِ. He says one of the dangers of people following these imposters is that they might eventually be led into believing بِإِمَامَةِ غَيْرِهِ مِنَ الْأَدْعِيَاءِ, in believing in imposters instead of the imam of their time. فَانْدَرَجَ فِي الْحَدِيثِ الشَّرِيفِ. And in doing so, this hadith applies to them. What hadith? من مات ولم يعرف إمامه مات ميتة جاهلية, he says. So they definitely acknowledge this hadith. Why do you have to lie about this? Why do you have to act in a duplicitous manner, in a deceptive manner to your dozen or so audience members? So these scholars most certainly recognize the authenticity of this hadith, and the problem isn't authenticity but your blatant duplicity. In fact, I honestly cannot fathom your arrogance and hubris. Why do you insist on rejecting this hadith? Kamal, the guy that you idolize, admits this hadith is indisputably authentic and even delivered an entire series on TV a few years ago about this hadith and its authenticity. Unless, I don't know, honestly, unless you think that even he's a deviant, in which case the famous Arabic proverb applies, وَيْلٌ لِمَنْ كَفَّرَهُ نَمْرُودٌ. As for the hadith that you cite as khurafat, again, I did say in the previous video that I don't want to waste my breath and my time with liars and deceivers and imposters. But once again, my aim is to show that these individuals are lying, that they're not being honest with their audiences. So he cites a hadith and he says, this is a clear example of khurafa, right? The one about the planet and whatnot. And see, that's the problem with someone who has jahl murakkab. In other words, he knows absolutely nothing but thinks that he knows everything. When a hadith is sahih, as you confess yourself, however, appears problematic or difficult to swallow for whatever reason, there is an entire science that scholars have developed in how to deal with such a hadith. If the hadith is in blatant contradiction with the Quran, well, that's a different scenario. If that is the case, then you reject the hadith. If not, if the isnad of the hadith is strong, what you do then is that you try and reconcile the hadith with your other established verses or other ahadith, right? For example, you either leave it aside, ضَعْهُ فِي سُنْبُلِهِ, as the Imams have told us, and just say that I don't know what it means. I don't know what the Imam is going for. I don't know what this infallible individual is trying to tell us. I don't understand it, so I won't apply this hadith, and I will leave it aside, put it on a shelf, and wait for either my knowledge to be completed or wait for the Imam to appear so that I could ask him in person. That's one solution. The other solution is you practice ta'wil, meaning you try and find an esoteric or alternative meaning for the hadith. So it doesn't mean what you think it does, it's got a different meaning. Instead of doing what you do, which is to mock and ridicule that which you don't understand. If you're going to use your logic as a litmus test for the truth, then you're going to have to throw away half the Quran, my friend. How does your sacred PhD accept an ant that speaks, or a prophet that flies around on a magic carpet, or a staff that turns into a dragon, or 1,000 other seemingly illogical stories, encounters, and miracles that have been mentioned in the Quran, right? قطعي الدلالة, قطعي الصدور, as you keep screaming. This is the Quran. What are you going to do with it? Anyone with a materialistic mindset like yours must grapple with these inconvenient questions by either rejecting all of them, as I predict you will do at some point in the future. You will get to the Quran. I've said this before, right? But for now, what do you do with these? Either you reject them, which I don't think you will do just yet, or you'll try to find some esoteric interpretation or an alternative understanding of these verses that reconciles them with your logic. In other words, you practice ta'wil. Just as the Quran, listen to this carefully, just as the Quran has allegorical and decisive verses, the Imams have told us there are allegorical and decisive hadiths as well. The hadith is like the Quran in the sense that parts of it are clear and parts of it are obscure. Look at what the Quran says. هُوَ الَّذِي أَنزَلَ عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابِ. He is the one who brought down upon you the book. مِنْهُ آيَاتٌ مُحْكَمَاتٌ هُنَّ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ. part of this book is composed of decisive verses. They are the mothers of the book. وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٍ. And others are verses that are allegorical. They're unclear. فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ ابْتِغَاءَ الْفِتْنَةِ وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ. As for those who have a disease in their heart, they will follow the allegorical portions of the book in seeking discord and fitna. Allahu Akbar, how God has correctly diagnosed the problem with these individuals. Ibtigha al-fitna, they're looking to cause mischief, to cause discord, to cause problems, to sow the seeds of doubt. وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ. And so that they can interpret the Quran, interpret these verses in accordance with their own understanding. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِنْدِ رَبِّنَا وَمَا يَذَّكَّرُ إِلَّا أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. And this is exactly what this person is doing. He takes a few hadiths that are allegorical or difficult to understand, or try to find an issue here and there, ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله, and to present our entire hadith corpus as being completely corrupted. Because here's the thing, once people are led to believe that our ahadith are tainted, that our scholars are corrupted and spoiled, then everything is fair game and they can exploit what remains of the faith and our religion to their nefarious ends and objectives. Citing one hadith out of hundreds of thousands to suggest that Bihar al-Anwar, which is an encyclopedia composed of 110 volumes, that somehow this hadith might support anthropomorphism. That's a cheap trick, my friend. If that hadith means what you think it does, then so does the verse in the Quran, وَجَاءَ رَبُّكَ وَالْمَلَكُ صَفًّا صَفًّا. Your Lord came along with the angels. How do you explain that? If God is not anthropomorphic, if God is not confined by time and space, if God is not a physical body that occupies physical space, then how does he come? وَجَاءَ رَبُّكَ. Or how do you interpret the verse وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ? How do you explain these verses? Unless you jump on the Wahhabi bandwagon, your own allies, and follow their own interpretation of these verses, the only other option you have is that you practice ta'weel, you practice tafsir, you try to find an alternative meaning for these verses. There are linguistic tools like majaz, isti'ara, kinaya, and others that scholars apply on the Quran as well as hadith. And as I said, scholars have provided several ways, an entire science devoted to addressing these kinds of ahadith. But then again, the Quran did warn us. فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ ابْتِغَاءَ الْفِتْنَةِ وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ. But for those in whose hearts there is perversity, they follow the part of it which is allegorical, seeking to cause dissension, fitna, by trying to interpret these verses, meaning interpret it in accordance with their own understanding.